Okay, welcome to the video on interpolation. One of the last things that you should have seen on the PowerPoint narration is converting the class intervals into the upper real limits. So we have what you saw on the PowerPoint right here, and we're all ready to go with interpolation. For interpolation, I'd like to have as our first question an x value of 44. The overall question is to figure out, for the x-score of 44, what is the corresponding cumulative percentage for that x-score? To get started, what we do is find where x-score of 44 falls given our upper real limits in our x-score column. Once we've done that, we can connect up the top and bottom of both the x-score and cumulative percentage values and the bottom portion of the x-score and cumulative percentage values, creating an overall picture that looks like this. For the x-score, the top is 49.5, the bottom is 39.5. Over on the cumulative percentage side, we have 100% at the top, 84% at the bottom, and we have the top and bottom of our eye diagrams that we use for interpolation. In addition to having the top and bottom, I think it's a good idea to have a midway point in both of our diagrams so that we can get a sense of where our intermediate value falls. The midway point on the x-score is 44.5. Put a little m here to indicate it's the midway point. And if you feel uncomfortable calculating the midway point in your head, you're doing it quickly, go ahead and use a calculator. Take the top, add the bottom, divide by 2, and you'll get the midway point. And you'll know you're right if the midway point has an equal distance to the top. In this case, notice it's 5 away. As to the bottom, again, 5 away. Do the same thing for the cumulative percentage. In this case, the whole interval width is 16%, so the midway point is 92%. After you've got the top and bottom of both of these scales, what you can do is take your intermediate value, the x-score that you're trying to find the answer for, and plug it in to the x-score eye diagram. At that stage, you can make an estimate. Try to figure out where your final answer will be in the cumulative percentage scale. Since we're in the bottom half of this scale, remember 44.5 is the midway point, we have to be in the bottom half of this scale, somewhere between the midway point of 92% and the very bottom of 84%. So an initial estimate is from 92% to 84%. And if at the end of the day we get an answer outside of that range, we know that there's something wrong. In addition, we could be a little bit more specific. Notice how close 44 is to the midway point of 44.5. Because we're very close to the midway point in the first scale, we have to be very close to the midway point on the second scale. So we're closer to the midway of 92 than the bottom of 84%. We're going to be real close to the midway point on the second scale. After you've got these diagrams set up, notice that we have top and bottom of both scales, midway point on both scales, and then we've got an estimate for our final answer. Once you've got that estimate plugged in, you're in great shape to go on to the 4 steps of interpolation, do the calculations, and then look at your final answer to make sure that it hits within the range of your estimate. For the 4 steps of interpolation, step number 1 is simply to find the interval widths, distances from top to bottom on both scales. So from 49.5 down to 39.5, we have an interval width of 10. For the cumulative percentage scale, from 100% all the way down to 84%, a difference of 16%. Then in step 2, we get to the all-important decimal. The decimal that we're going to calculate allows us to determine where we are in this scale and figure out where we need to be in the second scale. From a math standpoint, the decimal is formed by looking at the distance between the intermediate value and the top of the interval, 5.5 is the distance, and dividing by the entire interval width of our first interval. Notice how this corresponds to the interval width we got in step 1. 5.5 is the distance between the intermediate value and the top. 10 is the entire interval width. 0.55 is the decimal. It's a good idea to stop and think about that decimal and try to get a sense of what it tells us. The decimal will express for us a proportion above the intermediate value. So of the whole scale, how much is above the scale? One way you might want to think about it is think about it as like a road trip. 0.55 is like 55%. 55% of the road trip, 55% of the scale is above our intermediate value of 44. Notice how that also makes sense connecting up to our second scale. Notice that when we looked at this number, we said that it would be very close to the midway point, below but close to the midway point. That's very much consistent with the idea of a 0.55 decimal. If we were right at the midway point, the decimal should be 0.5, but because we're ever so slightly, just barely below the midway point, we get a decimal that's a little bit bigger, a little more than half of the scale is above this value. In step 3, what we do is we take that decimal and we use it to communicate with our second scale. We want to figure out what 0.55 means in the context of our cumulative percentage scale. We take the decimal, 0.55, multiply by the interval width of the second interval, 16%. And here's a first case where you might want to grab your calculator, if you haven't already, and do the math on that. 0.55 times 16% gives you 8.8%. 8.8% is step 3. And by the way, what step 3 does for you, not only here but in all cases, step 3 will always give us not the final answer, but the distance between the top of the second interval and our final answer. Step number 3 always gives us visually the distance from the top down to the final answer that we're looking for. And that down arrow, hopefully, corresponds nicely to the math that we do in our last step. The last step in our math is taking the step 3 value and subtracting away from the top of the interval to get the down to final answer. So 100% minus 8.8% is 91.2%, which is our final answer. Once you get your step 4 final answer, I think it's a great idea to go back and try to relate that to your estimate and try to get a sense overall for the idea of being in an equivalent location in each of 2 different scales. And think about it with respect to the decimal. So notice that in the original picture, we looked at 44, which is just a little bit below the midway point, which corresponds nicely to the idea of 0.55, a little bit below the halfway point. So in the second scale, with a midway point of 92%, we said we have to be below 92%, and of course we have to be above the bottom of 84%. Naturally, we're closer to 92% than to the bottom of 84% because we're real close to the midway point. Notice how well this estimate fits with our final answer, 91.2. There are some mistakes you can't help because you're human, but there are other mistakes that you can help. You can help because the answers that you get don't make sense. If you get a number that's outside of this range, not only is it wrong, it doesn't make sense. And that gives you an opportunity to look at the numbers again and see if you can catch your error. So that's it for the first question. X score of 44, we come up with an answer of 91.2.